Hello everyone, I'm Justin Byrne, one of the senior ecologists here at AI Dash, and today I'm going to be talking about watercourses in BNG and working parallel to the RCA. I'm going to wait a few minutes for some more people to arrive, and then we'll get started on the slides. I've been through the RCA training and I do BNG ecology assessments, and I also work with understanding how we map these things for the BNG metric. And this talk is really not targeted at people who have been trained in the RCA, that's the River Condition Assessment method, um, but it may still be useful for those people. It's more targeted at people who work with terrestrial BNG habitats, produce maps, do site visits, all that kind of thing, or work around that area, who haven't done RCA training and I'm a bit unsure about how their work um, fits around RCA work and how we coordinate between RCA surveyors and terrestrial ecologists who are doing other kinds of BNG surveys. So we're going to cover what watercourses are in the BNG metric, how they're assessed, what factors are important, how we map them. Then we're going to talk a bit about how we can do workflows with terrestrial ecologists and RCA surveyors, how we can use that to scope rivers in and out, calculate encroachment, and eventually look at how we improve rivers through interventions. I'm not going to talk too much in detail about that because it gets into thinking about design that is not really what this talk is looking to get into. It's more about how do we coordinate, how do we work. Okay, so um, what are watercourses in BNG? So hopefully all of this is stuff that we already know. Generally, watercourses in BNG are linear features, which means that the extent of the watercourse that contributes towards units is this center line measurement through the river. So here we have a river next to a site, and it has a watercourse footprint area, kind of polygon, which are we calling it, or area habitat, which has zero BNG value. That's not where we generate the value from rivers and streams in the metric. And that is associated with a line feature, a linear feature, which is the other rivers and streams line. And the length of that feature is what goes towards calculating units. Those units contribute to the watercourse BNG units and not the area habitats or the hedgerow units. When we're mapping rivers, we're not mapping subtidal or tidally influenced reaches unless they show riverine features. That basically means that when we get to estuaries or where the water is very brackish, the the RCA method no longer applies. All the kind of things that all the traits for rivers that they're looking at start breaking down when you get brackish water. So it's not really appropriate to use that method to assess the quality of rivers. So and instead we would map those areas as the combination of the subtidal zone, which is permanently below the low tide mark, or on average is below the low tide mark, and then the intertidal habitats that make up the riverbed, like mudflats or shingle or other things like that. So those estuaries will be mapped as area habitats. Watercourses generally are always linear habitats that may or may not have a watercourse footprint. And any real watercourses that we're seeing, so around hedges, would also be included as linear features in the watercourse section. So if you're having any kind of ditch or stream that's within or around a watercourse, within or around a hedgerow that is likely to be flowing, a good portion of the year, that's really a watercourse and not just a kind of a divot in the ground. We're probably mapping that as a linear watercourse section alongside a linear hedgerow section that is just a basic hedgerow, not a hedgerow with ditch. That hedge, we only ever would use those hedgerow with ditch codes, so habitats, of which they're various, when the kind of ditch feature isn't really a watercourse. Really, it's not likely to contain flowing water most of the year. It's not very deep, that kind of thing. And we're never going to be using the hedgerow with ditch and bank habitat alongside a genuine watercourse, unless there is genuinely, like say, a hedge bank which that hedge is on, and then a genuine watercourse running alongside it. In that situation, you might use that hedgerow with ditch cluster of habitats alongside a watercourse. So That's how generally we tend to map watercourses in BNG, and we map them in different types, don't we? So we have 5 different watercourses that we can map in BNG that are different distinctiveness values, which means they have different kind of environmental conservation value. So from high to low, those are the priority habitat rivers and streams, the other rivers and streams, canals, ditches, and culverts. And the RCA, the River Condition Assessment, only applies to the top 3 of those habitats. So priority rivers, other rivers and streams, and canals all have RCA work done on them, and ditches and culverts don't. And these are, you'll know from the metric that this is the table where those are laid out. Now, I think it's important before we kind of, from a desk-based survey, before we have got an RCA specialist involved, and when we're working out whether we need to do that, we need to have a good idea about which distinctiveness category of river we're looking at or watercourse we're looking at, especially between ditches and these top 3 categories. And I think that it's kind of generally recognised that the ditch definition here is a bit restrictive and not super clear in terms of how we're defining what ditches are and all the rest of it. And generally, we want to be not relying especially on data layers too much or desk-based survey to classify whether something is a ditch or not. Especially because when you get rivers that have been heavily modified especially around agricultural or pasture landscapes, they may look quite ditch-like, but actually be rivers. And in OS, they may even be recorded as drain features, where instead they're actually maybe a bit more natural. And so those may be thought of as ditches, but actually, if they're assessed, would probably be classified as other rivers and streams. In which case, what you might think of as a ditch feature that's out of scope of the site may become in scope when it's correctly described as an other river or stream. And equally, priority river habitats and other rivers and streams can easily be confused. And so it's important to know how to distinguish them. So I would get familiar with that process because it probably is happening before you're bringing an RCA specialist into the picture. It's still happening when you're working out whether you even need to engage with hydrologists and river condition assessment specialists. So part of that is knowing how to distinguish between ditches and rivers and streams and reading up on that. And other parts of it are things like the river naturalist assessment. So the naturalist, when we want to decide whether a river is priority habitat or not, there's a great data layer which tracks a lot of the chalk streams in the country, but it's not a perfect data layer and it's not complete. And the understanding is that you'll use data layers like that in assessing whether something is a priority river or stream, but also that you'll be conducting a river naturalist assessment. And it's good to get to identify who is going to be doing that assessment because it's not something that's part of the RCA, and it may not be something that the person who's conducting the RCA feels more competent to do than you. And the way that this river naturalist assessment is designed explicitly in the kind of documents around it is to say that this should be undertaken even if you're not an expert in classifying and mapping rivers, even if you don't have all of the expertise, having a general understanding is better than none. And so the aspects of the river that are considered are things like the physical aspects of the river, the hydrological aspects of the river, chemical aspects, and the biological aspects. And that together is ranked out of 5 to determine whether something is more or less natural. And rivers that are highly natural should be considered to be priority habitat rivers. So if you access the resources by searching for the river naturalist components or going through the links that are in the statutory metric, I would actually suggest that one more than searching because searching tends to get you adverts for doing this stuff, whereas if you follow the links, all the materials that you need are there. You'll see that there's this table. And I won't go into the details of it, but basically, the physical aspects are things like physical modifications of the river, and straightening of the river, things like that. Hydrological aspects are whether the flow regime has been impacted, and that's things like, it can be things like whether the river is kept at artificial levels or dried, or there are, locks or barriers within the river that manage the flow, those kinds of things. Chemical refers mostly to pollution and evidence of pollution that you can see you can follow this guide pretty well to get that. And biological is things like non-native species. So you should probably, everyone should, who's kind of going to site should be kind of familiar with doing these river naturalist assessments, because they're not supposed to be restricted to kind of river experts. And then by doing so, you can work out what distinctiveness category that watercourse is. So we've covered distinctiveness in quite a bit, but there's a number of other key aspects of how we generate a BNG value for watercourses in the metric. There's distinctiveness, which is the same as we get in terrestrial habitats. Strategic significance, which again is assessed through LNRSs, and otherwise when those are missing, a combination of professional judgment and evidence. Those are very similar to what we have in terrestrial habitats in BNG that you may be more used to. Whereas condition and encroachment are different for rivers than they are for terrestrial habitats. Like encroachment is not assessed at all. And for enhancements and creations, there's also temporal multipliers and spatial risk multipliers. We won't get into that too much. The only real aspect that is explicitly dealt with in the RCA is the condition assessment. And the RCA, the river condition assessment, can also contribute to our understanding of encroachment, but it's not explicitly part of the RCA assessment. And so one of the things I want to highlight in this talk is you need to decide before you go to site who's making the decisions about distinctiveness, conditions, strategic significance, encroachment. Is that going to be something that the terrestrial ecology team is going to be doing, or is it going to be something that the RCA specialist is going to do? All that stuff. Because I think it's easy to assume that someone will come out and do an RCA, and in doing so, they'll assess every part of this, when really the RCA really only is focused on condition. So when we have generated that information, sorry, my slides are not responding. Cool, okay. When we generated that information, we can then use that to separate out sections of the river. In the same way for terrestrial habitats that we would say split a grassland in half where it differs in scrub cover, we split rivers where they differ in distinctiveness, condition, or encroachment. And this is described kind of visually in the metric using this diagram. So here we have two sections of good river separated by a section of culvert, and then a separate section of moderate condition river. And all of those have their own polylines in mapping, and they're all represented by their own rows in the metric. And this might be how it looks on a site. So here we have a section of river that's kind of covered on both sides by trees, which is an important part of the bank assessment in the RCA. And then a section that's slightly less treed and more open and more sandy, and then a section where there are no trees and the bank profile is a bit different. So those three sections are likely to come from the RCA specialist or working with the RCA specialist as kind of three separate sections. And that's quite usual. You should expect rivers and watercourses on your site to be segmented in the same way that the hedgerows will be segmented because they differ in condition or distinctiveness. And broadly, these will normally be based around what we call the MORE 5 surveys, which are the survey units that rivers are looked at. So again, in the same way for hedgerows, according to the Hedgerow Survey Handbook, the hedgerow survey unit is 30 metres. And so broadly, hedges will be broken up into 20 or 30 metre lengths. The MORE 5 survey, which is different length depending on the width of the river, will be used to kind of judge segments of it. And generally, sections will be not smaller than the size of a MORE 5 survey, or they may be much larger though, if the condition is likely to be the same. And maybe that multiple MORE 5 surveys that reach the same condition assessment for the river might get combined together. How the RCA specialist does that is something you should discuss. Are they going to break every MORE 5 section into its own river segment, or are they going to join ones that reach say good condition, regardless of whether they differ within that strait in the individual criterion? And that's something that it's important to understand when we go to how we then plan on improving this river, especially when different sections of the same river may be, say, moderate quality or poor quality for different reasons. You may need to do different interventions across that length. And that's all just worth thinking about. And we'll get to that a little bit later in the talk. So what is the RCA? I've talked a lot about what it isn't. But what is it? So, as we've said, it's the condition assessment process for priority rivers and streams, other rivers and streams, and canals. And what it does is it divides the river into kind of three components. The channel, which is this section here, where the water is generally, like the general height of that's normally underwater, or is part of that channel bed. The bank face, which is the slope um, of the side of the channel, and you can see here that the bank face doesn't end here at the edge of the water; it ends up here. It ends up it covers the whole section of slope, and then there's the bank top, which you can also think of as that riparian zone, which is after the end of the bank face, you have the bank top where we assess other features in the riparian zone, and any terrestrial habitats that are covered by these areas are also mapped for like terrestrial BNG. And so in some ways you can get double accounting, you can get double benefits in the riparian zone because the terrestrial habitats will count towards your area habitats, but they will also potentially improve or impact your watercourse linear feature condition. And within these areas, separately, the natural and artificial aspects of each component are assessed. And then they're compared to an expected state of the river based upon the overall type of river. So the RCA divides rivers into different types depending on whether they're kind of high up in the watercourse, where they might be rocky and canyony and descend very steeply. That has different kind of properties than a very slow flowing river at the bottom of the watercourse length. So these natural and artificial aspects are compared to what you would expect for that river type, and then a score is generated. And then there are other things that the RCA does to calculate your final condition score. So when we're working with RCA surveyors, what we've kind of identified so far is they're not likely to handle every single aspect of the watercourse's BNG calculation. Definitely condition they will have a very strong impact on, but not so much. They may or may not feel like that's their responsibility to calculate the encroachment value or the strategic significance or the distinctiveness category of that. So we need to decide before we do that whether who's going to be responsible for generating that information. We also need to have an understanding of where their different features are. So it can be useful to have the RCA done before other visits, because when the RCA is conducted, they will firmly establish where the bank top is, and that's where you would calculate your encroachment from. So if you've gone to site and calculated encroachment, and then the RCA survey is done and a different bank top is set, then that can be confusing. So it's beneficial to have the RCA done first. You can hopefully determine the distinctiveness category of the river beforehand, but you need to work out who's determining that. And there are aspects of the river condition assessment that do contribute fairly directly to which encroachment category you're in for the channel bed and sometimes even for the banks. So the in-channel encroachment depends on things like jetties and deflectors, and the several of those categories are directly the same as what they are recorded in the RCA metric. So you should be able to look at the RCA metric and say, this is the category that's recorded there, so I can transpose that directly into encroachment and work out my channel encroachment. The RCA will also include things like large trash or weirs that also would relate to that channel encroachment that you can use, and it will calculate bed and bank reinforcement, which can fairly well be transferred into the encroachment metric for channels, with a slight issue that the thresholds used for high levels of reinforcement are a bit different from the BNG encroachment values. So you may need to look again at reinforcement and banks after this to calculate encroachment if it hasn't already been done as part of the RCA. So all that is to say is that it can be very helpful to have the RCA done first. Some information for encroachment can be directly lifted from it, but not all of it. So if there's additional information that needs to be generated for the encroachment value of that feature, work out who's going to do that. Another important thing to do in this process is scope in and out rivers. So is a river that's off-site something that I need to consider? So any sites that overlap with the riparian zone of a river are considered to have that river in scope. And this riparian width will vary with the watercourse width. So here we have two watercourses, a very large watercourse that's being joined by a smaller watercourse. Both of these have the same buffer zone around their banks for the riparian zone of 10 meters. And the different buffer sizes are different for the different distinctiveness categories of watercourse. So ditches have a smaller buffer zone, but culverts have no buffer zone. An offsite culvert is always out of scope. But priority rivers, other rivers, canals, they have a larger buffer zone that calculates their riparian zone. So here we have a modified grassland, and the edge of that is within 10 meters of this river. And so probably this river is in scope. And you may have to make a decision about whether or not this river is also in scope, depending on how you're defining the bank of this river versus this river. And those kinds of things about tributaries joining and which river is in scope and which one isn't are complicated. So it's worth working that out beforehand. Where you've got a river that's been straightened or significantly altered, you may have further challenges um, with where that river is. You know, it may look like it's out of scope, but it's worth talking to a hydrologist because it may be the LPA decides that because that river should be more meandering and now you're sitting in that floodplain or that area that it used to meander around when it was more natural, maybe even that's considered in scope. And although that's not described directly in the metric, it is worth knowing about. And finally, there may well be watercourses on your site that you cannot see. So culverts, most obviously, it's important to have a map of where water features have been culverted, and this knowledge is really often very difficult to find. And we think about winterbournes, which are rivers that only flow when it's very wet or in certain seasons. And you may be visiting a site in the summer and there may be no evidence that there is a watercourse that flows here in the winter, but that watercourse and those culverts are in scope and are part of your river condition assessment, but part of your BNG value, sorry. So you need to look out for them, and I would look out for them by reviewing historic imagery. So there's things like the National Library of Scotland, I think, has like historic imagery viewers where you can go back for the whole of the UK and look at whether, say, there was a river there in the 1800s or so that has now disappeared, which might indicate that there's a culvert underneath your site. Or you can look at historic imagery or LiDAR imagery and go, there must be a river that flows here at certain times of the year. And you might catch that in the historic imagery. And obviously, like talking to the site owner or people who have lived around the site is very important too, because they may know that at certain times of the year, there's a part of the site that gets very wet or even has overland water flow that will indicate to you that there is a watercourse here on site that needs an RCA survey, even if you hadn't been expecting that. So that is quite challenging. So those are things certainly to look out for with that workflow. One of the things we talked about is deciding where that riverbank is. So riverbanks in the RCA method and the BNG are different from what maybe a hydrologist would call a riverbank. And that's because this process of the BNG metric and the RCA is designed for non-experts to use. It's a citizen science method. And so it's defined what we call, what's it called? I think geometrically, I think that's the term, which basically means to say that the bank top is where there is a break in the slope, regardless of what that means hydrologically, whether or not it's reasonable for that to be considered the bank top. The question is, where does the slope break? So here, for example, as we exit the river, there's a steep slope that levels off. Where it levels off, that point, that's where the bank top is. Not anywhere up the side of this thing here, it's right here. In fact, I can indicate where we probably would draw that line with a nice pen drawing here. That's probably where we draw the bank top. And on this side of the river, the slope doesn't break until maybe up here. So it's much higher, even though the water level is probably never likely to get that high unless it's in flood. The bank may be difficult to understand where it is. And you may have sections of the river where there are different bank heights, vastly different bank heights, depending on the profile of the river. So where it's a very smooth transition from steep slope to flat, that's very clear where the bank is. And we can work our riparian zone 10 meters out from that. But on the other side, maybe there's a large, long, steep slope that doesn't really let up until it's quite high up. It could be way higher than you're expecting. And it may be that it's decided the bank top actually is right at the top of that slope, regardless of how high or far away it is from the river. And that's where we start our riparian zone in that 10 meters. So what I'm trying to stress with this is that it is quite challenging to know where a bank top is going to be without talking to an RCA or without a bit of practice yourself. So you do need to get familiar with this. And this is a rather extreme example. This is a river that flows through a wooded valley. And you can see there's a steep slope here and then a more shallow, gentle slope coming up over here. Maybe on this side of the river, the bank top is kind of in a sensible place. But on this side, especially like say this point, it may be that an RCA surveyor at this point puts the bank way up this side of this river because there isn't a break in the bank in the slope. And that's why it's so important to work out where riverbanks are before you get too invested, and where, especially because say, if the bank is established up on the side of this rather steep slope, you have another 10 meters from that to decide what's in scope. So your actual building, your actual red line boundary might be a long distance, 10, 15, 20 or more meters away from where the water is actually running, but it may still be that you are in scope of that river because of the profile of that riverbank. And so that's why it's important to discuss this very early on, establish where the bank is so you can scope rivers in and out. And hopefully you don't have any ridiculous situations, but you need to have that conversation so you don't have, run into an objection from the LPA who says, actually, you're in scope of this river. Right. So those are the kinds of major aspects of of river conditions that we've discussed so far. I want to spend a bit more time now talking about how we calculate encroachment with some worked examples and what counts towards calculating encroachment. So, what is encroachment? We've already described that channel encroachment, encroachment, forms part of that. The overall BNG value of a watercourse habitat, and you have channel encroachment and riparian encroachment. And channel encroachment is in that area between the banks of the river. And primarily, the BNG metric describes it as concerning structures and bank revetment. So, reinforcement of banks, objects within the river, that kind of thing. But it also includes stuff on the side of the banks. And obviously, culverting is a form of channel encroachment. Riparian encroachment is primarily to do with like land cover and land use and land management. And it's only in that 10-meter zone from the bank top. And so you can think of it as kind of channel encroachment tends to be structures and riparian encroachment tends to be land cover issues. So, but it's worth stressing that on these long, steep banks that you may get, especially in the upper parts of a river watercourse, this section in the middle, this bank, this between the river edge and the bank top, that's part of the channel encroachment. The riparian encroachment only starts in this 10 meters afterwards. And this is comes from a conversation I've had with people at Natural England about this strange thing because it's not really well described in the metric that this section falls within the channel encroachment, because channel encroachment tends to mostly focus on things like jetties and piers and trash and stuff like that. But because this is considered part of that channel from a BNG perspective, and you can see this in the diagrams in the metric, that is where you would classify encroachment there, and it wouldn't make sense really, given how riparian encroachment is calculated, to include this section. So we can probably do a lot of the encroachment value for the channel directly from that RCA survey, aside from the kind of provisos that I've made earlier about the thresholds being slightly different. Whereas encroachment that is to do with the riparian zone is mostly to do with habitats. So we're talking about any land cover type that reduces the quality, quantity, or ecological function of the riparian habitat. So most of the urban habitats in the BNG metric will fall into this category, unless they're very small, these kind of very small amenity utility features that have a footprint of less than 5% of the riparian zone. But broadly, sealed surfaces, unsealed surfaces, walls, etc. But also any artificially managed land. So public parks, plantation forest, farmland, pasture, football field, anything that is artificially managed land is going to count towards something that impacts the ecological function of that riparian habitat or the quality of that riparian habitat. So I think that can be a bit of a surprise for some people. I was doing an RCA assessment on a river that flowed through a public park, and there, because however natural the land looked, it was part of this artificially managed, accessed, public park. And in discussion with people, we kind of decided that there was no way of modifying that high encroachment value because of its situation, and sometimes you can't do anything about that. Um, but yeah, another, you need to kind of think about that. It may look relatively natural, but you need to think about management. Is this an artificial habitat? Um, and finally, structures that inhibit the natural access to the riverbank are also forms of encroachment in that riparian zone, or indeed in the channel zone if it's on that bank face. So what that means is that walls, like wire and wood fences, or large drops, especially around like sheep piling, that you might get reinforcing the side of the river, all of that impacts the ability of animals and even plant life to traverse from the riparian zone into the channel. So all of that counts as encroachment. And even hedges, especially where they're dense, can count towards encroachment, because it's not just about animals getting into the river or out of the river. It's also about things like the natural flow of material into the river, like wood or like rocks, that kind of thing. And if you have a very like a fence or wall will obviously do this. Wood will fall, especially on a steep slope, will tumble down the slope and then get caught in the wall or the wire fences, and won't go into the river to contribute to that natural ecological functioning of that river. And hedges can also do this. So a popular thing that's happening nowadays, especially, is planting hedges alongside rivers as part of their improvement. But it's important to kind of think, is this hedge going to impact the ability of wood to kind of roll downhill into the river that will then create habitats for the wildlife that lives in the river? So structures also form part of that encroachment. So I have like a uh, example here of how we might think about that encroachment, and in the metric the way we calculate encroachment is in these different bands. So there's a kind of here, this is a river, so it's a 10-meter riparian zone, and here I've got no watercourse footprint. It's a very small river, so we're just going to go off that line of the centre line of the river as the riverbanks. And we've got a 4-meter buffer, an 8-meter buffer, and a 10-meter buffer around that river. And we can see here that although footpaths are excluded from established footpaths are excluded from repaired encroachment, these fields are going to be part of that, are going to be encroaching features. And I've decided that this strip of land in the middle probably wouldn't count towards encroaching features because it's a broadly natural habitat. Although you may disagree with that, and that's part of your own assessments. So here we would say that on both sides, within that 8 to 10 meter zone, we have encroachment. And so we follow the method in the metric about the different zones and all the rest of it. And so we would score this minor for encroachment, in that the left bank and the right bank both have minor encroachment in that 8 to 10 meters. And we can do that without an RCA specialist as long as we know where the bank is. Ditches as well also can be done without an RCA specialist, especially because there's no condition assessment in the RCA for ditches. That is done as part of the usual terrestrial BNG assessment habitats, whatever. So if you're a terrestrial ecologist, you should probably familiarise yourself with the ditch condition assessment, because I wouldn't expect an RCA expert to be completing it. So you would do the condition assessment in theory, or that person would do the condition assessment. They would also calculate the encroachment and the strategic significance and the distinctiveness value. And it's not likely that the RCA specialist would go out to do that. Maybe you discuss that during the work, but it's not something that should be assumed. So for ditch encroachment, we have a very similar process, very similar size bands, but they're half in size because the encroachment, the riparian zone is half the size. So here we have a 5 meter, a 4 meter, and a 2 meter buffer around the river for those different sections. And we can see that, let's say, it looks more or less that this, say, the north side of this river is all broadly natural habitats. And the bottom of it, again, we only have encroachment on this 5 to 4 meter zone of the area around this field. So we might go to this river, this ditch, assess it, look at that 4 to 5 meter bank top, and see the encroachment from the agricultural land, and decide this is a minor / no encroachment score. So one bank would get no encroachment, one bank would get minor encroachment, and that's how it would be recorded in the metric. Okay, so that's how we do encroachment, and I think that, it's important that everyone involved in doing BNG is familiar with how we classify distinctiveness, strategic significance, encroachment, and condition for the relevant aspects of watercourses. Apart from the RCA, that should really be something that the only RCA people have to worry about. And then you can work out whether the river is in scope or not. You can together work out where you're going to site that bank top. So you can think about where that's going to be in terms of riparian zone, where it's going to be in terms of encroachment. And that's for all watercourses. And we're going to look for watercourses that we may not have spotted from data or from aerial imagery that may be only flowing, say, at certain times of the year. And we're going to be aware that those may be in scope, even if they're off-site, if they're in that riparian zone, because we are scoping rivers in and out based upon their riparian zone with a knowledge of where the bank top will be established. When we've got all that information, we can start thinking about interventions. And I think this is another area where I think the RCA process doesn't prepare you as well as it might in all occasions for doing the BNG aspects of the work. The RCA is not a BNG process. And so I think you can do all of the RCA process, get signed off, and you may not really even know how to take the results and weave them into a BNG assessment and planning process. That's something that's possible. Well, hopefully people who work with the RCA and BNG will know how to do that. It's important for us or non-RCA experts to have an understanding of how we work with the outputs of the RCA process. So what would we get out of the RCA? What we get is a preliminary condition score initially, which is then combined with the information from the river type to determine final condition score, which includes a modification based on whether the river is over deep. And that's something that the RCA person will work out, that end condition score. And that's what we need for the metric. We just need to have encroachment, strategic significance, distinctiveness, and the final condition score. But when we start thinking about interventions, we want to know how we get from good, from moderate to good, or moderate to fairly good. And to do that, we need to understand how we generate those uplifts. So if we were looking at a forest, we would know that you can do things like improve the deadwood. You could look at the different areas and look how they score, and look at how you would move them from one category to another. And the RCA is quite similar in that it scores all of its different criterion from -4 to +4, which is a bit different from how we do things in terrestrial habitats. And for different river types, it may not be possible to get a score of, say, +4. It should be possible for all negative components, that's the things that are detrimental to river quality, to get to 0, but to get to +4 for the positives isn't always possible. And it all depends on whether that feature is likely to occur in the river of that type. So you're not going to have a super diverse flow type in a very slow moving lowland river. It would be counter to that river's natural ecology to introduce things like waterfalls and maybe riffles and other stuff like that, depending on where you were. And so maybe we shouldn't strive for that. And that's accounted for in the RCA process. So if you go to Gurnell et al.'s paper, which is available for it's open it's published open source, so you can read it. They will provide for these different river types. So these are the river types A to M. What the likely score for these different sections are in that. So, for example, all river types can get a bank top riparian vegetation structure of 4, but for bank top water related features, and that's things like pools or ponds or channels on the sides of the river, it's very unlikely that rivers that are high up in the watercourse, very rocky, canyony, even mountainous rivers are going to be able to have a marsh on the side of them because it's just too steep. It's not the ecology. So that's why the maximum likely score for, say, a type C river, which is relatively high in the watercourse, is 1 for that. So if we get a RCA result back and we're looking at the detailed nature of it, we should not be trying to improve every single positive score to 4. we should be doing that knowing what is likely to be possible, especially because you could put an intervention in, but is it going to stay for 30 years? Is it going to stay for the length of the project for which BNG is assessed? If it's not suited to that type of river, the answer is probably no. Probably it's going to get washed away or dry out or change because rivers, are going to regress to a type. So have a look at this. It's in the paper on river condition assessments published by Gunnar et al., which you can review. That's one of the documents that I think we can provide a link to that in the slide deck. So when we're looking for improvements, we want to be aware of what that best likelihood, the maximum the score that we're likely to get for that type of river is. How close are we to that? Where can we get the biggest wins for the least amount of effort? Where can we get win-wins? So where can we get improvements to the riparian zone that will also generate BNG units for the area habitats? That'd be great. And also let's look over case studies over what works and what doesn't work. And I'll go to that in a second. And so even if you don't have any knowledge of rivers, you can actually get quite far into this process of planning improvements or suggesting improvements as part of a collaborative team, especially, just because the process is designed to be really accessible. Yeah. When we're looking at that, a really good way of thinking about whether you're enhancing or creating something in the BNG metric is that all the positive things that you do count as enhancements, and all of the negative things that you do count as creations. So that don't be putting things that are beneficial for the river in the creation section, and don't be putting things that are dubious for the river. So you're having to do negative things because it's required for development. All of that goes into creation. And don't get too worried about otherwise, but is this like positive is enhancement, negative is creation. Very simple. Okay. And when we think about what things we might be doing, definitely take some time to look over the River Restoration Centre manual of river restoration techniques. This is being regularly updated, and they're looking for more case studies, but it includes really simple, actually really cost-effective examples of river restoration that are basically straightforward. And when we're getting into this, it's absolutely essential to involve the relevant experts on this. We want to have engineers, we want to have hydromorphologists, we want to have people who know what they're talking about more than I do because I'm not a river expert. But there are great examples of what's achievable, and we can start thinking about that relatively early on in the process. And you can get much more familiar with that even if you're not an expert on rivers by especially looking at this manual of river restoration techniques. And I definitely feel that way as a terrestrial ecologist, looking at how we do RCA work, of going, how would I even know how to improve the siltation of a river? Well, let's get started by looking at the resources. Okay, I want to talk about a few odd things that also happen. So within the BNG metric, certain river interventions especially are not going to fit into BNG happily. So for example, I was recently working with somebody who wanted to deculvert a river on a site with very few opportunities for enhancing the area habitats. And by deculverting that river, they were losing a large area of the site to the watercourse footprint because that land would become a valueless land in BNG. And even though the land was quite low value already, that really restricted how much space they had to do positive interventions. So when you've got situations like that, especially with rivers, where it's so difficult to fit them into the BNG metric and follow all of the rules because you're doing something that's really good, but it doesn't really fit. That's what Rule 4 in the metric is designed for. That Rule 4 basically allows you to do bespoke, unusual things that are really beneficial to nature that don't really fit into the BNG metric, but you should talk to the LPA and work that out. But it means that you will probably be able to find a way forward with that site, especially because you're doing something that's so beneficial for the hydrological regime of that area. So don't lose hope if if you're looking at this and you're going, I don't know how we're going to affect this and follow BNG rules. That is what that rule 4 is for. When you're doing something that's very positive, but it's not easy to fit into the metric. And finally, the most common things that I hear are the problems with BNG metrics that come through for watercourses are that we have got LPAs rejecting things because the riverbank height is wrong. Where that bank has been established is just the wrong place. It's too close to the river or too far away from the river. And that's why it's important to agree with the RCA specialist and whoever else is working on this, where you're going to be determining that bank height is. Another thing is that culverts aren't mapped, again with winterbournes, so you do need to look for those, and you do need to consider whether or not ones that are off-site will be in scope, especially for winterbournes and other distinctness category issues. And that's what we get here, wrong distinctness category. So rivers have not been considered in scope because they were misclassified as ditches, or priority habitat rivers are not considered, etc., etc., etc. So do try to get that right. And finally, that positive interventions are included in the creations tab rather than the enhancement tab, or vice versa. So positive things go in enhancements, negative things go in creations. And that's all I've got time for today. Before I go, I just want to make sure that if you've enjoyed this and you'd like more information about, I've got lost here in my slides, and more information about how more information about doing BNG work, or would like to have maybe work funneled towards you, or get more support from a kind of a network of ecologists working on BNG, we have our BNG AI partner program, which you can join for free, and there's no obligation, there's no strings attached. It will just be there as a method of funding work towards you, and also learning more about BNG. So, for example, these resources, this webinar will be posted on our knowledge base for people who are joining this eventually. So, please do get in touch with us and let us know about that.